My name's Jenny Manson, and my maiden name was Salomon, and I'm Jewish, but completely secular. My mother lived in Haifa when she was a young girl. She escaped a pogrom in the Ukraine, and she arrived in Haifa when she was about 5 and lived there till about 1925, 1926. However, when I began to identify as a Jew, in order to argue against the state of Israel and its behaviour and its conduct, my mother supported me, which was very welcome. So my mother was a Palestinian, and her best friend really was the Palestinian girl next door. And she used to say that the Palestinian girl's father always said, because my mother loved to argue, which has been carried on to me, "You're going to be a barrister one day." That's what she used to quote. And she loved his support. And my father's family were English Jews. I formed with many colleagues last July, Jewish Voice for Labour. It actually says voices, and we hope to be many voices, but Jewish Voice for Labour. For this purpose, many of us are totally secular, identified as Jews for a specific reason. There was an organisation called the Jewish Labour Movement, in which you don't have to either be Jewish or Labour, and you just have to be a movement. And I'm not questioning what they stand for, what they do, but their name is misleading. So we decided that we had to say that we are the Jewish Voice for Labour. But if any of you here are interested, we have associate members. In fact, the associate members are getting nearly the same number as the full members, because we're very keen to not be exclusive in that way. You have to be Labour. You can't be just a movement. You have to be Labour or Jewish and Labour. We started the organisation for two purposes, I would say. One was to work with other Jewish organisations, which I'll mention, on behalf of Palestinian rights, and the other was to tackle allegations of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, but that's for another night, if you're interested in a talk. And I was actually with various members of staff of Jeremy Corbyn and Shami Chakrabarti today talking about that. And certainly recently, Jewish Voice for Labour is starting to be listened to more as things change in the Labour Party. But tonight is about Palestinians. It took me a while to change my mind about Israel. I don't know whether there are any other Jews in the audience here, and whether it took them a while as well. I went when I was a student before I went to university in 1966. I left school quite young, and I wasn't comfortable there. But it took a while for the discomfort to grow, and in the early 2001, I joined Jews for Justice for Palestinians, which some of you might know about, and I want to talk a little bit about what I do with them. But more recently, I went to the West Bank, so I didn't want to go back to Israel again after '66, so my only other trip was with a Jewish group, another group which I don't identify terribly much with, but organised very good trips to the West Bank at the end of 2016. I don't need to repeat here really what I saw, although it was horrifying, and the checkpoints, the injustice. We were taken around East Jerusalem. Just want to mention a couple of points people may not know about. One, the village, I've forgotten the name of it, where they have a demonstration every Friday night. You may know. Yeah. Two of the women we talked to had both been shot in the leg. They were shot in the leg because a child had picked up a stone. If a child picks up a stone, the military are allowed to shoot. Now, can you imagine in England, whatever we think of our country, if demonstrators are shot routinely, and the normalcy of shooting. Another aspect is the military courts. Now, I don't know if you know, but if you're a settler living in comparative luxury and with well-watered lands and a lovely swimming pool, next door to a village where in many cases high unemployment and extreme poverty, if a settler steals from the local shop and a Palestinian steals from a local shop, the Israeli is subject to the civil courts back in Israel, and children can't be taken into custody and they have proper protection. But the Palestinian is subject to the military courts, and this is due to a military order that has not been lifted. And my husband, who we each get shot by particular things, it was the military courts that absolutely drove him to despair. They were very neglected buildings. The Arabic translator was shouting the translation, and he wasn't translating, we heard, the full text. And we saw a child, 15 or 16, being hugged by his parents, and the father spoke to us afterwards, and he said, I only see my son once a year or so when he's taken to the court, because of him or some other reason, my freedom to travel was taken away from me, so I can't go and visit him in the... but almost the worst thing for me, which wasn't the worst thing, but the thing I felt so impotent afterwards, was when we went to another village, I'm afraid I've forgotten its name, and one of the people who spoke to us, he and my husband and I, Mike, spoke to him, and he said, I get weepy on this, he said, can you help me? And I've come back and thought, how am I going to help? Well, one more point, and then I'll get on to what possible help we can all do. I knew I was going to hear you two, but even so, I spoke to a Palestinian whom I know well. She's back in Palestine at the moment, and she's called Amal. And the reason I spoke to her was what she did at a meeting I went to where I heard her speak, is she talked a little bit about actually what it feels like to her, for her day by day, less about the facts and more about the sense. So she said that she'd come to this particular meeting because she wanted to, I talked on the phone and I wrote down, because it's important to humanize the Israel-Palestine issue, because we're all human beings, and it's very easy to not recognize this. But then she was concerned that some of the people at the meeting sort of assumed that there were two sides to this issue, that, you know, the Palestinians would have to give a bit and the Israelis would have to give a bit. Well, of course, this is absolutely crazy. There's nothing more for the Palestinians to give. So she said that it's impossible, she says. You're not equal in life to your Israeli counterparts, but you're supposed to be equal in responsibility. You're supposed to be able to sort it out. But then she said, you're not free ever. I've never been free. I'm only free when I'm not in my own country. And it's not just about checkpoints and barriers. It's about being denied the atmosphere to show who you are and what you want to do with your life. And finally, we talked about the fact that she considers that Palestinian lives are cheap, and the only attention is to when an Israeli is hurt. So what can we do? Well, probably the most useful thing I do is I lobby for the organisation called Jews for Justice for Palestinians, which means going round to the embassies and talking to them. I don't know if it's useful or depressing, I'll just explain. I found that the view of diplomats in all the embassies we've been to, including the American embassy, I might say, they are aware of the imbalance, they are aware of the abuse of Palestinian rights, and they are sympathetic towards it. What we've got is, and maybe that's something Christine to comment on, because it's a wider view really, we've got this impasse, haven't we? Even before Trump, there is no way that the European countries and America are going to, at the moment, to really force Israel into any behavior. I mean, we must think perhaps about the various sanctions that the BDS movement is one option. Sorry, I'm not being very encouraging, but I come away from these embassies thinking, what ammunition can we give Europe and America, let's say post-Trump, to make them realize that eventually they are going to have to force Israel to change its ways, either with sanctions or withdrawal of aid or withdrawal of military support. We spoke to the Russians, interesting, quite a while before this crisis, and the Russian view was, it's going to, not very encouraging either, but it's going to explode. We are just standing by. Eventually, the Arab countries will be armed significantly and will turn on Israel, which isn't also a very good solution, because I don't know what the rest of you think, but I don't want anyone to be killed, Israelis or Palestinians. sorry, not very encouraging, but I think the main point to bear in mind is there aren't two sides to this issue. I mean, don't let people, I think, convince you that there's got to be a proper negotiation, as in the Palestinians have got to concede. That's just not, it's not fair, there's nothing to concede. Anyway, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Jenny.